Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. This is Women in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Stephanie Double. I'm Director for Shared Interest Groups with the Yale Alumni Association, and we're bringing you a webinar in partnership with Yale Women, the Yale Alumni Health Network, and 50 Women at Yale 150 or 50 Way 150. So I am so excited for today's webinar. We're going to be hearing from some amazing speakers. First of all, I just am so thrilled to introduce to you the chair of the Yale Alumni Health Network, Dr. Jamie Wells. Dr. Jamie Wells is a renowned pediatrician. She currently serves as an adjunct professor in the Drexel University School of Biomedical Engineering, Science, and Health Systems, which is actually the nation's first degree program in pediatric engineering. And she's also on the Leadership Council of the Wistar Institute, which is the nation's first independent biomedical research facility and certified cancer center. So Jamie has, in her incredibly interesting past, also been a doctor in Manhattan. She's been director of medicine for an educational advocacy nonprofit. She's published over 400 articles informing the public and policymakers on health-related topics. And she has been awarded several distinctions, including being named one of America's top pediatrician by Consumers Research Council of America. And she's been awarded America's Top Physicians Honors of Distinction and Excellence. So let's give a very warm welcome to our very own Jamie, welcoming her to give you all some opening remarks.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to YAA and all of our co-sponsors today. I am super thrilled to learn everything about COVID with sex differences, stress, you name it today. The Yale Alumni Health Network's mission is to break down silos of the health-related disciplines to spur innovation and drive our alumni career development. So we would love to hear from you. You can reach out to me if you're interested in coming up with ideas for programming or participating further. Please email me, Yale Alumni Health Network at gmail.com, and we would love to hear from you. We have an upcoming event at the end of the month, Health Bingo and Happy Hour. In October, we're doing a breast cancer event, Health Tech in Breast Cancer, co-sponsored by Komen, and we're having Yale alums who are researchers in tumor biology from Penn. So we have a lot of things on the books, and we're extremely excited. So if you'd like to get involved, please reach out to me. Today is very thrilling, and I have the great privilege of introducing Susie Krentz, who will be moderating and hosting this event today. Susie is a 1980 graduate of Yale College. She is president and founder of Krentz Consulting, which is a firm focused on assisting hospitals and healthcare systems with their business strategy. She is a member of the Advisory Council for Women's Health Research of Yale, and she is the brainchild of this webinar, and it is sure to be a super thrilling and informative event. So Susie, I pass it on to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate the warm welcome. In introducing this webinar today, I thought I'd first give you a little short background on women's health research at Yale. It was founded over 22 years ago as a self-sustaining center within the School of Medicine. And from its beginning, it's been at the forefront of really pushing for and incorporating the study of women in health research and in understanding the influence of sex and gender differences in health. And in addition to supporting research, the center's mission also includes training the next generation of researchers and clinicians and advancing health policy. On our webinar today, we have actually two impressive and wonderful professors from the Yale School of Medicine. We have Dr. Carolyn Mazure. She is the creator and the director of women's health research at Yale. She is the Spungen-Bildner Professor in Women's Health Research and Professor of Psychiatry and Psychology. We'll also be joined by Dr. Akiko Iwasaki. She is the von Zedwitz Professor of Immunobiology and Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology, and she serves as an investigator for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. She's an elected member of both the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. Our webinar today is going to be in two parts, with an opportunity for Q&A by attendees after each of the sections. For our first topic, Dr. Mazure and Dr. Iwasaki will have a conversation about some hot off the press research related to sex differences in immune responses to COVID-19 and their implications. The second part of the webinar will be a conversation with Dr. Mazure related to the science of stress and finding resilience in the time of COVID-19. So as I mentioned, after each one of these two sections, there will be the ability to have Q&A from the audience. You're going to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen, not the chat tab, but the Q&A tab to type in questions that you may have. And I'm anticipating we're going to have more questions than we'll possibly be able to answer in the time we have, but we'll be, looking for questions from the audience. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Mazure and Dr. Iwasaki. And please make sure that you're unmuted if you're a panelist.
Thank you very much, Susie. Appreciate that warm welcome from you as well. It's a pleasure to be here, and we want to thank YAA as well as the shared interest groups for sponsoring us and hosting us. And Akiko, it's so good to be with you as always. We decided that the best way to get going was really to start with my making two broad introductory comments, and then I'll be asking Akiko a number of questions, and then we'll open the conversation, as Susie had said, to the rest of the audience. So in terms of these two broad comments, this is really to serve as an introduction to the study that's about to be discussed by Dr. Iwasaki. The first comment really is to say that to successfully confront and mitigate the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, the nation requires a medical and a behavioral path for implementing interventions. And as researchers, we share the view that science can provide the data to take us down the right path. The coronavirus globally has sickened well over 13 million people. These are the reported numbers, and we know that probably more people than the numbers that have been reported. So around the world, about 13 million people, and it's killed over 500,000 people, again, based on reported numbers. There's an important study that came out of England recently on 17 million adults, and that study indicated that men face nearly twice the risk of death than do women on the basis of their contracting COVID-19. Uncovering this difference in the outcome of a disease and then investigating how the disease is handled differently in women and men is a terrific scientific opportunity to understand better the underlying mechanisms of the disease or how the disease operates. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the first half of the seminar today, webinar. Secondly, my other comment really is turning to your study, Akiko, and your special area of expertise, the human immune system. So as just a few words about background, it's important to say that our immune system is our defense against invading pathogens, whether they're bacteria or viruses, and this includes the novel coronavirus. Extensive prior research looking at immune system and immune system responses has clearly shown that the immune system of women and men differ, and that those differences affect health outcomes. Women tend to have more responsive immune systems than men, which can help us in very many ways. On the other hand, it can also result in conditions where our own immune systems attack us, and the consequence is immune disease. And over 80% of those who have an autoimmune illness are women. So, knowing that our immune systems act differently in women and men, and that our immune systems play a major role in fighting COVID-19, coupled with evidence that men are likely to suffer more severe disease and die at a higher rate from COVID-19 than women. What you've done, Dr. Iwasaki, is study how immune responses to COVID-19 differ between women and men to understand how the disease works. So my first question today is, what study did you conduct and what were your findings?
Dr. Mazure, thank you so much for that introduction and the background. That's really necessary for me to speak about our research today. So I'd like to share some slides so that I can take the participants and panelists through what we've studied and what we found so far. So let's see. Okay, so just a little primer about the immune system. For those of you who are not immune experts, I just wanted to touch on the fact that there are two tiers of immune response, the immune system. One is called the innate immune response, which is immediate and it's non-specific, and it's a defense system that is mediated within minutes of encounter with pathogens. And these are mediated by white blood cell types such as macrophages and neutrophils, and epithelial cells that cover the surface. The second tier is induced as a result of more severe virus infections. And this is the adaptive immunity, which takes about a week or two to develop fully. But once they're developed, it's highly specific and it provides a long-term memory defense against viruses. And this is the basis of all vaccines, that we develop these memory T and B cell responses. B cells are the ones that secrete antibodies, and T cells are the ones that recognize infected cells and get rid of them. So the study that we conducted with the support of women health research at Yale is really the analysis of patients that came through the Yale New Haven Hospital. And we only focused on the patients that were not in intensive care unit and that were not treated with immunosuppressive agents in order to study their natural immune responses. So the patient group in this cohort, which we call cohort A, consists of 39 patients, 17 men and 22 women. We also recruited healthy donor, which are the healthcare workers that work in the hospital. And we've also extended this to a much larger cohort of 98 patients to see what the disease trajectory will tell us about the differences in the sex differences in immunology, immune response to this virus. So first thing we noticed was this very interesting phenotype where we measured these cytokines, which are these alarm signals that are secreted by these innate immune cell types that were elevated much more highly in the male patients. So the orange circles here are the male patients compared to the female patients. And another type of cytokine known as IL-18 is also elevated in male patients compared to the female patients. And consistently, we saw that male patients had a lot more of these inflammatory monocytes, which are one of the key mediators of these cytokine storms that you probably heard about, which occurs in severe cases. So all in all, inflammatory monocytes as well as inflammatory cytokines are elevated in male patients. On the other hand, we notice an opposite trend that women tended to make better T cell response. So T cells, as I mentioned earlier, are key immune cells that detect infected cells and eliminate them from the body. And women who are indicated here in purple developed much more robust T cell activation than male patients' counterpart, which is the orange here. So we know that these sex differences existed already at this first time collection from male patients and female patients. Now we wanted to know whether that can tell us about the trajectory of their diseases. And so we looked at male and female patients and followed them into those that maintained low disease status versus those that developed worse disease. So the filled circles here are those patients, either male or female, that developed worse disease, whereas the empty circles indicate ones that have maintained moderate disease. And what we saw is that in male patients, the severity of disease associated with age, so the older the male patients, the more severe they tended to develop disease. And also BMI status, so the higher BMI in the male patients were associated with deteriorating disease, which was not observed in the female patients. And what's striking is that, so I told you that male patients develop low T cell activation, but if you look at among those patients who did worse compared to the other, you see that male patients that developed low levels of T cell immunity tended to do worse, much worse than those that developed moderate level of T cell immunity. And of course, female patients tended to develop much better T cell immunity in general. There was no difference in severity between the female patients. And this was true no matter what we looked at, whether these particular activation markers or interferon gamma, which is a key cytokine that the T cell uses to fight the infection, is also the same. So the male patients that secreted low levels of these cytokines tended to do worse with disease compared to those that had elevated levels. Whereas female patients, there was no difference in these parameters. And conversely, female patients that developed higher level of these innate immune cytokines did worse in the disease. So these are just 3 examples of such innate immune cytokines and chemokines. What we see is that female patients that developed more of these kind of factors tended to do worse with the disease, whereas male patients, there were no difference. And this is my final data slide. This is another striking finding that we have from this study, is that if you look across the age group, so this is 40 to 90-year-olds here, and we asked how well T cell immunity develops in female versus male patients, what we see is that the female patients never decline their ability to generate T cell immunity even in old age. Whereas male patients, as you see, there's a rapid decline in their ability to mount T cell immunity when they become older. So I just put a little dancing woman here, but essentially, women tend to age better with respect to their T cell immunity, whereas men decline in their T cell immunity as they age. So to conclude this, what we found was that the men developed more inflammatory cytokines in response to COVID-19, whereas women developed better T cell immunity. And this correlated with men developing low level of T cell having worse disease outcome. And conversely, women with higher level of inflammatory cytokines had worse disease trajectory. And finally, we found that women aged better with respect to their T cell immunity than men. So I just want to end my presentation by acknowledging the amazing members of my laboratory, as well as this was a huge team effort, over 100 people involved in various aspects, including the impact team. And then of course, I want to thank Carolyn and others in support of this research through the Women's Health Research at Yale and several other funding agencies. So I'm going to stop sharing now.
Well, that was terrific. And it does inspire me to ask you a few more questions just related to the study itself and break it down.
If I could just interject, as you ask your next question, we'll be moving to Q&A in a minute. So again, if people have questions, put them in the Q&A feature. We'll have a little conversation here, but in 2 or 3 minutes, we'll flip to audience questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's break it down then, Akiko, if we can. So when infection occurs, there's a cytokine response. And the function there of that response is it signals the immune system to do its job. It says, okay, we're being invaded, you got to do something about this. And we want cytokines to actually increase at that juncture. And what you're finding is the relationship between that response and the T cell response out of adaptive immunity is really the nature of the response that's seen more frequently in women. That acceptable balance is seen more frequently in women than it is in men. So it's the nature of the response that accounts for the heightened disease susceptibility in men. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so that is a very nice summary of what I talked about. So the way I think about it is that women, because they can develop T cell immunity, they can control the virus infection rapidly. Whereas men who don't develop T cell immunity, they don't have any other means of fighting this infection. And therefore, they have to trigger this hyper responsive overdrive in the innate immune response. And that is leading to a pathology in this case. So I think, and that is exaggerated as people age. And that's sort of the fundamental insights that we gained from this study.
And could you say something then about how this particular study and what you have found not only is important in terms of beginning to understand the underlying mechanisms, but how it might relate to treatment, how it would inform us about that?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. So based on what we found, older men tend to have a very difficult time developing T cell immune response. So they may benefit particularly from receiving a vaccine that can enhance their T cell immunity. And hopefully vaccines can do it better than the natural infection. And secondly, women who deteriorated with their disease tended to have higher levels of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. So immune suppressive agents and monoclonal antibodies against these cytokines might be more suited for treatment of this group.
So it's conceivable that we might need a different vaccine for men and women?
I'm not sure, Carolyn. Well, hopefully vaccines will work on any age, any sex, but I think that men at risk really should be getting this vaccine quicker, because they really don't have the means to develop their own immunity on their own, the older men.
Well, you also identified another potential risk factor, and that is high BMI.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way in which a clinician might begin to think, well, here's somebody who's an older man, he's got high BMI, so this person is at greater risk.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so there's a larger cohort of studies. So we only focused on about 100 patients here, but there's a much larger cohort of study that's ongoing at Yale New Haven Hospital that includes almost 10,000 patients. And so that is much better power to look into these kinds of demographic issues.
That's great, because I know you and I have talked about the fact that when you read the literature and you read the New York Times and other kinds of venues where you get public information, you find that there are three major risk factors that appear to crop up over and over again for contracting the disease and having poor outcomes. And that would be sex, that is male sex, is one risk factor, age, older age, but also race. I take it you were not able to look at race in your sample because it was such a small sample of individuals. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's correct. However, this 10,000 patient study that's ongoing, I mean, they're definitely more powered to look at these issues, and I think they are looking at these issues.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, in your opinion, given all of the work you've done in these areas, that using sex differences here as a model is useful? Could you say something about what you think as a basic scientist is important here?
Absolutely. So whenever you see two group of people who respond differently or who are at different risk for disease, that gives us an opportunity to hone in on the molecular mechanism underlying that difference. And so what we've been able to do is, because of all the epidemiological data coming from all over the world, that male sex is a risk factor for this severe COVID-19, we were able to really hone in on the sort of immunological differences. And from here, we'd like to dig into the molecular mechanism of why there is such a difference between male and female.
Well, sorry, I was just going to say that Akiko anticipated my next question, so she's already answered what her next steps are.
Great. We're going to take some questions that have been coming in, and there are a lot of them. First, just as a comment, a number of people were hoping they could either get a copy of the slides that you shared today, or is there a place to get more information about this research?
I'd be happy to share these slides if there's a link that you guys can provide.
Right, and we will be sending out, actually a follow-up email will be sent to everybody who registered after the webinar that we can attach a link to, so we can include a link to those slides. So excellent. Okay. And a number of people had some questions also related to kind of who was in the sample, like looking at what kinds of, were you able, again, the sample wasn't 10,000 patients, but there were questions about comorbidity, or were there pregnant women in the sample, et cetera. I'm assuming your research was focused on the sample you had.
That's correct. Yeah. So we didn't, we weren't able to, we weren't powered to dissect the comorbidities and other, key factors that's going to influence also. We did account for obviously the age with analysis that we've done in the study. And there's a lot more detail that you can find. We put it in a Med archive. So if anyone's really interested, I will also send the link to the Med archive article.
Okay, excellent. That would be fantastic. And again, I'm looking at, there were a number of other questions. I assume again that it was an adult sample that you had. There was a question about related to the response of children, and your sample probably did not include children. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. This is an adult sample.
Okay. Mm-hmm. There were a couple of questions, and again, I'm not a scientist, so you can tell me, how these work, but they were related to blood type. So there's a question, is blood type the real issue? There was another question of someone who actually had stem cell, so now was a female, but now has her siblings male blood type. Like, does that affect anything as you look at this research?
That's a fascinating thing to look into. Unfortunately, we didn't have anyone who has blood from one sex and the rest of the cell type from another in our cohort. Obviously, it was a very small cohort, but I would love to get into that kind of research, like what cellular compartment is responsible for the sex difference. Is it the white blood cells, or is it the stromal cells that are supporting the function of these white blood cells? And those are really key questions. So in the future, we'd love to get into that.
There was another question of how do you know that developing the cytokines, the T cell at lower or higher rates isn't a result of the disease as opposed to, a predisposed tendency?
Yeah, so that's a little hard to tease out, but that is why we focus on the very first sampling. So the patients coming into the hospital and enrolling in our study, the very first time we draw their blood, and we ensure that they had pretty moderate disease at the time of collection. So nobody was on any immunosuppressives or ventilators or anything that would affect the immune response. And that's why we focused on the early time point. And hopefully we were able to look at their natural immunity as opposed to something that the disease is doing to them.
Another question, so in general, kind of women have these more robust immune systems. So one is, what does robust mean? And secondly, why did women and men end up differently with their immune responses?
So from this study, what I would call robust is their women's ability to stimulate T cell immunity. And we've also looked at B cell immunity and antibody response. While there was no statistical difference, there was the average of antibody that women were making was higher than men. So we think in general, the adaptive immune response is more robustly stimulated in women, especially when they age. And that is probably a function of their preservation of the sort of intact immune system as women age, whereas men, we see this sort of precipitous decline in their ability to stimulate either the antibody or the T cell response. So, why that is, that's probably has some evolutionary background as to why women are preserving their immune response to older age. Maybe it's a grandparent, in fact, I don't know. But that's also generally seen with flu vaccines as well. People from other studies have shown that flu vaccines, women generate much more robust antibody response to flu vaccine than men of the same age.
Okay. And again, I'm going to, Carolyn, ask you in a minute if you have a last question you want to ask Dr. Iwasaki. Again, there were a number of comments in the questions, which we can't get to today, related to the study sample and if there were other pre-existing comorbidities that were considered, a number of things related to some other health conditions and the impact of estrogen or changing estrogen levels. So there were a number of different questions, and just for people who are on, we will actually keep these questions and they may inform there's some ideas here that might stimulate some other comments or other webinars we might do that would answer some of these. So Carolyn, I didn't know if you had a last question you wanted to ask before we end this section.
Well, sure, because there are, as you said, Susie, so many questions. But my question to Dr. Iwasaki would be whether or not she has a comment about asymptomatic individuals. Another colleague of ours from Yale has done a study recently that's a very important study showing that asymptomatic persons, whether they're actually turn out to be pre-symptomatic or they remain asymptomatic, are more infectious. And we wonder about why somebody can actually be asymptomatic. I wonder if Dr. Iwasaki has some thought about that.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk only about the pre-symptomatic because that's easier. So this virus seems to be a master of evasion of immune detection as well as symptom detection. So in the first, 4 or 5 days of infection, people are completely not feeling any symptoms while the virus is replicating to very high titer in the respiratory tract. And so when you speak or sing or cough or sneeze, that virus will be able to transmit to others. And that's part of the reason why this COVID-19 is so successful in transmission is because of this pre-symptomatic infection capabilities. And so we have other studies ongoing that is looking at how this virus evades any kind of symptoms in the first few days. And it probably has to do with the viral genes that block immune signaling.
Right. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Dr. Iwasaki. This was incredible. Again, we just got a little glimpse into the work you've done, but there'll be other resources for everybody that you can connect to when we send out the follow-up email so that you can see other things. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you with additional research, all the next step research projects that you'll be doing. So thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for having me on this panel. My
Excellent.
pleasure. Yeah. Thank you.
We're going to turn now to the second topic of our webinar today, which has to do with the science of stress and finding resilience, during this time of COVID-19. And you just have to look around and kind of say, is this like the perfect storm for stressful conditions? Not only do we have a pandemic, we have the economy, we have people who've been trapped in their homes for months with their school-aged children, trying to serve as teachers and educators, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a lot going on. So what I'd like to know, Dr. Mazure, is are there any indicators that this is a particularly stressful time for women?
So Susie, this is a stressful time for everybody, but there are indicators that the stress levels are worse for women than for men. And I'll give you a couple examples. The first, I think, that springs to mind really is if you look back at the start of the pandemic, back in February and March, you saw the numbers for job loss during the month of March coming out in April. And what you saw was that job loss due to the pandemic was largely affecting women. The majority of individuals who lost their jobs back in March were women. And subsequently, of course, unfortunately, many Americans have lost their jobs, and those rates have varied up and down, but nonetheless, the point here is that women were the first to lose their income stream, and that difference can't be made up. I think that's also important in the context of understanding that the majority of individuals who live in poverty in this country are women. So to lose your job is really very, very critically important to this majority of individuals, as well as a lot of other individuals who have other considerations. The second thing that I might say just about that is we are learning more and more about the high correlation between joblessness, the inability to pay your bills, and adverse health. So it has a lot of downstream implications if you lose your job. The second thing that I think would be important to consider as indicators for why it's slightly more stressful for women to moderately more stressful for women has to do with the fact that if you look at who the healthcare providers are in our nation, US Census Bureau lets us know that 76% of the overall healthcare workforce in the United States are women. It's not true for physicians and surgeons because there are fewer physicians, surgeons that are women. But even there, about a third of those individuals are women. If you turn to registered nurses, for example, 85% of that workforce are women, 85% of nursing aides are women, 90% of nursing assistants are women, and so the list goes on. And during this crisis, as a consequence, it's important to realize that many, many women are on the front lines, and that really creates a stressful situation, not only for them personally, but for their families and for others. And then finally, the other point I'd like to make is that, in reference to your question, is that the majority of people in the United States who are caregivers are women. And in addition to the usual childcare and other home-based responsibilities that we think of when we talk about caregivers, I think it's useful to know that about 1 in 6 adult women in the United States also provide unpaid care for family members outside of the nuclear family. And they help not only these distant relatives, but they also help friends. So women play a big role in caregiving. And at the time of a medical crisis, that really is exacerbated and then has an intersection as well with performance during your job. So for those women that were able to maintain their jobs and have high-level jobs as well, it's important to consider what's really happening there. And there have been studies on academic women showing that academic women are performing not as well as men in terms of their journal publications, in terms of the other metrics that are used.
So I'm sure men are experiencing stress at this time as well. You talked about why it disproportionately, there's some stress factors on women. So if we have men and women both stress, does it affect women stress differently than stress affects men, or is it kind of the same thing?
Well, actually, there's been a lot of research in the last couple decades about this. And what we have found, including in my own research, that stress is a real risk factor for various kinds of adverse health outcomes, but it's a more potent risk factor in women than it is in men. We found that in depression, we found that in substance use, we're finding that in other areas of disease as well. So it's really an important factor to consider that stress affects women more adversely than men.
And here we are talking about stress. So I'm just going to ask the obvious. We use stress all the time. I'm stressed out, or what is stress? How do we know if we are stressed, and where does this whole idea of stress come from?
So stress has been with us forever. But the stress response is actually something that's very functional, because what it is it's an alert. It's an alert to us that there's a perceived threat in the environment. And when we get that alert, the stress response is the following. Certain things begin to happen very quickly in our bodies. And what happens really is that so-called stress hormones are released. It notifies our brain to take action, hit the gas pedal, so that those areas of functioning that you need for what everybody has heard of, fight or flight, become activated. So what that means is energy is rushed to muscles, for example, through glucose, and there's increased heart rate, there's increased breathing, shallow but increased. And what also happens at that time is the primitive parts of our brain take over. And along with that, to complement that, the other part of the stress reaction is the part of our brain that's responsible for executive functioning, making decisions, that goes offline. Because at that juncture, you're either trying to figure out how to fight or how to fly away and get away and escape. And so it's not the time to be thinking complex thoughts. It's a time to really act. And so it's important to keep in mind that when stress is high, we're not always thinking as clearly as we normally do. And so that's really kind of a very quick outline of what happens when the stress response kicks in.
Okay. So obviously I don't want to make a lot of bad decisions because I'm under stress, et cetera. So, or all the other consequences, I guess, of being in a stressful situation and experiencing stress. So what does one do? If we want to reduce stress, we want to, get out of that fight or flight mode. What can we do? Right.
So just before I address your direct question, What you said a moment ago, I think, was really fascinating, because we know that something happens to us in terms of our ability to think well if we're very stressed. You often hear people say, don't make a big decision now while you're very stressed. They're not saying to themselves, your sympathetic nervous system is in overdrive, you better not make that decision. They know it, though, because they've observed it. They've seen it in themselves, they've seen it in others. So it's really important that people understand the mechanism, because then they can broaden the utility of their knowledge in that regard. But to answer your question about what we can do, so if you think about it, everything is moving very fast. You want to slow it down. There are a lot of techniques that are very helpful in that regard. There's yoga, there's mindfulness, there's meditation, there's actual cognitive and behavioral therapies that people can use. But it's really important to understand how, for you, there's a particular intervention that works to slow that system down.
Okay. So we're in this, a lot of times fight or flight is you're under attack, or, some incident happens and it's stressful. So you either know to, fight or to run away. What happens in the kind of environment we're in, where I feel like it's been months of this environment, this condition with stressful factors? What happens if this is like stress goes on and on and on and on? Is there any consequence to that? I mean, I can't run a marathon, so I assume at some point my runaway thing is going to have a problem.
Yeah, I think that's the right question you're asking, because I think that's the situation we're in now, where the stress of the experience of the pandemic and all of the corollaries to this and all of the collateral issues has really created a situation in the country where many, many, many of us, if not all of us, are feeling this sense of persisting, enduring stress. And when that's happening, different things happen in our bodies. And in fact, at that juncture, our brain starts notifying our adrenal glands over and over again, produce more cortisol to amp up your body to make sure you're ready to respond to this threat. So the stress response initially, as it's derived as a biological initiative, is very functional, and it helps us because it says, look, there's something out there, you've got to protect yourself. However, in contemporary society, it's a modern problem to say that we can't turn that off, we can't get offline, we can't turn that response off very easily. And if we don't turn it off, and we keep generating all of this amped up kinds of physiology, it leads to various predictors of disease.
Okay, and just a comment, we're going to be turning to questions from the audience soon. So again, some people have started putting questions in the Q&A feature, but if you have some for Dr. Mazure, please give some thought to that. So that question of we're in this sustained condition, wherever, your observation, when you look at us as a country, as a nation, your city, your community, your state, are we in that situation? And is this exacerbated because it's not just me under this, but it's me, my family, everybody is in this state of stress simultaneously?
Yes, I think we all are experiencing that. We all have, there are different valences attached to different things that happen in the world as far as you're concerned versus I'm concerned. But yes, we're all in this sense of, I think, what's experienced as enduring and uncontrollable stress, which are the two types of stress that are particularly pernicious.
Okay. And then you commented earlier about, are there things we can do? Do we, do yoga or meditation, things to help alleviate? One of the other things I notice is every time I pick up a newspaper, it was the Wall Street Journal yesterday or today or something, it's all about stress. And then it talks a lot about resilience. Is kind of, how does that fit into the addressing and dealing with or functioning better in situations of stress?
So I think you also read in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and everywhere else that you should have a balanced diet and you should exercise and you should get sleep. And I know at this point that all sounds kind of boring, but I just do want to say that it's true and those things work. So if you're having those kinds of difficulties, it's worth working on that. But in addition to that, I think it's really important to understand that there are two things that I would offer. One is that if you are, in fact, in this environment in which stress feels uncontrollable, there needs to be a way in which you can create a structure that brings control back to you, to your environment. And everybody's structure is going to be different, and everybody's routine is going to be different. But it has to really be based, in my view, on a personal structure in your life that you understand, that you find rewarding and brings meaning. And with that structure, with those ingredients, comes a sense of control again over the environment. The second thing I was going to just offer before we jump to questions, though, was this, back to resilience, that the basis of resilience is really having purpose in life.
Mm.
So the other things that we sometimes don't pay enough attention to, in addition to remembering our values, is really remembering our relationships, valuing those relationships, and building that into a sense of purpose. And with purpose in life, you can start building then resilience in your life.
A couple questions relate to thinking about different subcohorts, not just women, but do you have any from studies that you or others have done? Does stress present or behave differently on, Black and brown women? Another question is, are older women more susceptible to stress than younger women, or are they quicker to respond to stress than younger women? So anything related either to race or to age, does that affect our understanding or reaction to stress?
There are some very important studies that are being done looking at Black and brown women in terms of the experience of stress. And I think the bottom line here is that women of color experience more stress in the course of their daily lives that really comes about as a function of stereotypes and discrimination. And even though those stressors are not the same as the kinds of stressors often thought about in research, like someone in your family dies as a major stressor. But these stressors that I'm talking about for Black and brown women occur every day, almost at a level just under the surface, but all the time, every day. And those kinds of stressors mount up and adversely affect health. So there is a lot of information that's emerging. It's important information for us to pay attention to. And there's much more to say. We could do a whole day on stress, obviously. But the second thing to say about age is, it's not so much that stressors change. Stressors change as you age more than your stress response to stress itself. So there are variables that affect what you felt was stressful when you're 20 and 50 and 60 and 80 and how you cope with them.
A question came in that, you've mentioned that there are diseases that are exacerbated by stress, or that stress, makes worse. What might be some examples of the diseases that if you're stressed, like you didn't realize that one of the reasons you had this health issue was because of the stress?
Well, I think a good example is blood pressure. So people who have high blood pressure, people who have diabetes, people who are vulnerable to stroke, all of those conditions can be exacerbated by stress. Certainly my own work over the years studying stress, depression is really a big issue there, as anxiety disorders are as well.
Okay. Somebody wrote in that they have heard that a different response for women to the fight or flight is shelter and retreat. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that, or is that?
No, I think that's worth commenting on. I'm glad someone's asked about it. There's also a notion of tend and befriend, and what this is about is that, is there a male model that's more fight or flight and a female model that's tend and befriend, or some other type of way in which we're socialized to behave in the face of stress? And I think this is important because physiologically at base, we're all going to have that fight or flight response. But who we are is not just our biology. And so as a consequence, there are these layers of who we become as a function of how we're socialized. And so women have more of a tendency to respond to stress by also trying to cope with it in terms of tend and befriend or other kinds of ways of behaving.
And a question that kind of relates a little bit to the tend or befriend, someone says, could you speak a bit about the role of communicating and talking about one's stress with one's families, co-worker, extended communities, oftentimes women might be nervous to talk about the fact that they're even experiencing stress.
Right.
There's a stigma, I guess, about being stressed.
Right, exactly. And I think women are right to be concerned about it because there is stigma attached to saying, I don't feel well, or I'm feeling stressed. So I think one way to approach those kinds of discussions is not to start with the issue of stress, but to start with the issue of where we are in this contemporary society, almost the way we started our discussion today, Susie. What is going on? What are the facts? Again, as scientists and researchers, we're always going to go back to the facts because we find that even though facts shift and change as we get more data in, the facts really are the bottom line for how we're going to live our lives. And so I think you could start a discussion like this, talking about, gee, if you look at the news, it appears that this is happening and that's happening. All of those things seem like they would be very stressful. And I think you can open a discussion then about what people find stressful because it will be different for people.
Okay. Someone has a question about, do hormones offer any protective function for women against stress pre-menopause? Is there any relationship of hormones to stress, or is that not something that's related in any way?
Well, I would be remiss to say it's not related in any way. But I think that we don't know enough about how that is related, particularly with regard to premenopausal women. But the question may be based on the fact that there is this notion that as cyclicity moves forward, there are different points in a menstrual cycle when women feel more sensitive. And so I think from that perspective, hormones, like anything else within our body, can affect the way we feel. And the way we feel affects the way we think. And the way we think affects the way we feel. So there is a give and take with regard to that. And I think the question is a good question because it really alerts us again to being sensitive about the fact that we all have cyclicity in our lives.
And there was a request, which I don't know if you can do here, but if you could cite some studies that talk about the impact of stress on women, especially as it is different as it relates to men. So again, I think there are people who are interested in finding other resources to do some more follow-up reading to understand this kind of stress and the impact of stress on women better. So I don't know if there's a place people can go, or we could later share some resources.
We can certainly share resources in the follow-up that I know that Stephanie's going to send to everybody. But I would also add that this is just like a commercial for saying we need to study sex differences and gender differences more than we do. We've made strides, there's no question about that. But doing this over the last 22 years, despite the fact that we've seen change, in my view, we still haven't seen enough change. And we need these kinds of questions and these kinds of inquiries from people to say we want to know about whether there's a difference, where there's a difference, and what impact it has. And that's really, I think, a take-home message from the COVID-19 study.
Okay, great. With that, unless you have another, that was a good closing comment, I think. Stephanie, I'm going to kick it back to you for our closing comments and wrap up. And Dr. Mazure, thank you both for your interview with Dr. Iwasaki, your comments on stress, and for leading women's health research at Yale, which does actually explore and support and try to promote the study and the influence of sex and gender on health. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mazure. It has been a pleasure having you here. And thank you so much, Susie, for being our fantastic moderator. I'm just going to take the last couple of minutes here and talk, basically have a few other folks come on. I am going to quickly just introduce to you Jennifer Cruz. She's going to say a couple of words about 50 Yale at Women at Yale 150. So Jennifer Cruz is the program manager within the YAA for special events and the 50 Women at Yale 150 initiative. She and her team work primarily on 50th anniversary celebrations of the first 3 classes of women admitted to Yale College and the 150th anniversary of the 2 women who entered the Yale School of Art. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome Jennifer in here.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for the opportunity to co-sponsor with Yale Women, Yale Alumni Health Network, and the Women's Health Research at Yale. 50 Women at Yale 150 recently went viral and launched our virtual summer series of webinars. We are featuring a variety of content, including a live chef demonstration and a webinar on happiness in the time of uncertainty. In addition to the summer series, we'll be hosting a special virtual conference inspired by 50 Women at Yale 150, beginning this upcoming September 24th through September 26th. The virtual conference will feature an array of innovative and thought-provoking keynotes and panels with prominent Yale women in politics, academia, the arts, and much more. For more information, check out our website at celebratewomen.yale.edu. And please be sure to check back frequently as we're adding new content and features on a daily basis. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Very exciting what's going on with all of that. So
Yes, very exciting stuff.
yes. So let me just bring on our next person here. Hold for a moment. So this is apparently the time of the webinar where we have amazing Jennifers coming and talking to us. So thank you to Jennifer Cruz. And now I am very pleased to introduce to you Jennifer Madar. So Jennifer Madar is the president of Yale Women. She is Yale class of 1988, and she's also a member of the Yale Alumni Association Board of Governors. She's been a tremendous alum. She was also the immediate past president of the Yale Club of Boston. So I'm very pleased to just turn this over at this moment. For the last couple minutes of this webinar, Jennifer is going to give closing remarks. And again, Yale Women has been a tremendous co-sponsoring shared interest group for this webinar. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for all of that. And I leave it in your hands. Just unmute yourself there.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay, great.
The stage is yours, Jennifer.
All right, wonderful. So thanks so much for your introduction, Stephanie. As you mentioned, I am Yale College Class of '88, a proud Salamander for those of you for whom that's important, and the current chair of Yale Women. And I just really wanted to take a few minutes to start out by thanking everyone who made this webinar such an incredible success. First of all, thank you to Dr. Mazure and Dr. Iwasaki, and also Susie Krentz for such an enlightening conversation on this incredibly timely topic. As an alum, as a woman alum, I am so pleased to know that there's a center at Yale that works to make sure that health research and treatments include sex and gender. So again, thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Jamie Wells and the Yale Alumni Health Network for organizing this webinar and introducing 50 Women at Yale and Yale Women to co-sponsor. The Yale Alumni Health Network is one of the newer shared interest groups, and you're already doing such an amazing job. So thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie and YAA, for your incredible behind the scenes work to make this webinar and all of the webinars that we've had lately during this period a reality and a success. Really cannot overstate the amount of work that you guys put into this to make it so effortless. And finally, really thanks to all of the wonderful participants for your really active engagement and thoughtful questions that will, as was pointed out, help to inform future topics for webinars. So I'll just close quickly with a few words about Yale Women. Yale Women is a shared interest group that's committed to building community among women alums and using our collective awesomeness to make a meaningful difference in our communities and the world. If you aren't already a member of Yale Women, I invite you to sign up to receive our quarterly newsletter and periodic communications about events of particular interest to women alum at yalewomen.org. And you can, of course, also join us in conversation on social media, on cross-campus, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So in closing, thanks again to everyone for making this such an amazingly successful webinar, and I wish everyone a wonderful day and a safe summer. Take care.